We just finished a massive weekend in competitive Warmachine with multiple tournaments across the country, so let's figure out what the meta's looking like. My name's Ryan, and I used to be good at Warmachine. Welcome to the Spell Rat. Of all the events that's happened over the weekend, I'm going to start with kind of the biggest ones and then work our way down. We've got 4 major events to talk about. So the first one we're going to talk about is Nova Open. I'm just going to skip to the Masters. There were multiple pods at Nova that fed into this top 8, and then you had a top 8 Masters qualifier to figure out the top spot. Obviously, as you can see here, top spot going to Infernals. What's really interesting here, kind of a meta balance wise, there are 3 different Infernals lists inside of the top 8. Otherwise, I love the sort of the meta variance and having Kador number 2 and a Signar number 3. Crix at 5, we would obviously been seeing a lot of Crix at 5 and 8, and then out of nowhere, Crucible Guard at number 7. Balance-wise, one part that is a challenge here for Steamforge is they're coming towards, planning towards the end of the year. You can look at the winner here, and Zadaroth is the only character that won 3 times, and then you even look at the next Infernals player, Zadaroth. We'll get to this more because we'll zoom out and we'll actually look at the meta, but I do think we have some meta issues and some balance changes that need to be addressed. But obviously Nova looked like a fantastic event. We do have a fairly good representation here, apart from Infernals just kind of absolutely dominating. Next here we have an event in England, and obviously here we have a completely different meta. When you're looking at the top 8, you have Sea Raiders, which is just great to see them in a pole position. They weren't even represented at Nova in the top 8, and here they are taking the first prize. You have Shadowflame number 2, and then a couple of Gravediggers where their universal win rates have been a little bit lower as people have been trying to figure out the faction, here in the 3 and 4 spot. Followed by Signar, Brinebloods, of course, another Shadowflame, and then another Crix at the end. One thing that, again, meta-wise, it's really interesting to look at, you look at the Orgoth here, and you only have 1 caster represented. And it really shows you just a tremendous balance issue that we have inside of that faction. They have a good caster, and I mean, generally, Sea Raiders are not seen as one of the top tier factions right now, so clearly the army needs to come up a little bit. But Horus himself needs to come down again. Really, though, I mean, really kind of, again, wonderful diversity, especially when you compare this event to the last event. There's no Infernals here, just like there were no Gravediggers in the other list. You got a couple Signars on both places. You've got some Crix. So again, pretty good diversity. And then in Seattle and Washington, we had Mox Boarding House, and that one saw, again, a Gravediggers taking the top spot. Wonderful to see Gravediggers on the top spot. Gravediggers obviously still a new army, one that people are getting used to. I think they're a very challenging faction to play. I do think they have all the tools that they need to win. It's just a matter of putting those pieces together, and it takes a special player to do that. Obviously, in this case, Brandon Owens is that special player. Also great to see Brinebloods here at number 2. We saw Brinebloods in the English event, so more kind of faction diversity here. Signar, Shadowflame Shard, here's 1 Infernals. But now you're talking about 1 Infernals, that's 4 total over 3 events. That's 24 players. And so really it starts to kind of spread that meta out a little bit. So maybe not as big of a win rate issue. You see a couple of legacy factions followed by another Crix. So obviously Crix is just, fantastic these days all over the place. Last one to look at is the Rocky Mountain Rumble. Here, looking at the 3 and 0s, great to see Kador up near the top. We have Orgoth there, and then, smattering of other factions, another Kador. Surprisingly, no old Umbries are sneaking into the accounts here. I'm kind of surprised to see that, just because Old Umbry seems like they've been a pretty strong faction. And I don't know, a little more diversification. You get Grimkin in here. Again, Crix is just really good. Notably, we're not seeing, I'm glad to see Kador in here. Notably, really, I think Dusk is the real main faction of the newer factions that's not included in any of these results. So let's zoom out a little bit. So now I'm in the statistics section. The filters here I'm looking at, I'm just polling the last 3 months. I'm only looking at singles events. I'm excluding virtuals events, and I'm letting it be rated and unrated. I feel like this gives us the best kind of cross section of data and singles events, especially because team events throw too much noise into this. The reason I'm going back the last 3 months, it gets you a lot of new cricks in the meta and gravediggers. And so it's kind of a good look at actual like what the meta is right now. So obviously there's always a little bit of noise at the top with some of these legacy factions that have really small game counts. Grimkin starting to see come back to life and actually have a reasonable number of games played. This number seems to be climbing pretty quickly. And so as you are thinking about Warmachine in the meta, we do need to be thinking about what Grimkin are doing and what they look like. Obviously, Wanderer and Old Witch and the Child here are most of your play rates. Wanderer, obviously, with a 73% win rate, be it a smaller sample size, is something really everybody needs to keep an eye on. From there, we end up with Infernals, right? Infernals was that faction at Nova that had 3 of the top 8 slots, and Zadaroth himself, period, is just a problem. I mean, 64% win rate over this sort of sample size, it's a lot to handle. It's an issue. As we come down, this is the last 3 months of data, so the old Umbri here sample size is relatively small, but they're coming out of the gates at a 57% win rate. Pretty darn good. We didn't see Gravediggers anywhere near that high when they started. Gravediggers still have not approached numbers close to that. And Old Umbri only has, a third to half of their faction out at this point. And so people are doing really well with really limited resources. So it'll be curious to see if is this Old Umbri overtuned? Is this Old Umbri where opponents don't quite know what they do yet? But the question you also have to ask there is, if opponents don't know what they're doing, how good are the pilots at piloting them at the same time? Crix, obviously, no surprise. Crix has been an absolute monster in the meta recently. Kythos here has a lion's share of the games, up near 60%. Kythos, again, feels like another model that's overtuned, and Crix keeps getting resources. They've had, obviously, with Kythos, they've had other Cephalix models printed. They've got a Colossal coming soon. Crix, absolute powerhouse coming into the end of the year. Just to round out the top, we'll go finish the legacy factions. Shadowflame start at 54%. This is where we start feeling a little bit more in the balance range. Marauders, Storm, Legion, and then Callus at, kind of a perfect 50% win rate. Gravediggers at 49, I feel like this is a number that's been creeping up a little bit. And then down here we have Orgoth at 48. Obviously, Orgoth needs a little bit of improvement on a faction overall. You just got to be mindful of the Warcasters themselves, because Horus here is at a pretty high win rate. Same could be said for Dusk. Dusk does have a moderate win rate, and you kind of look at the faction and think, maybe do they need help or not? Tyrus here, still sitting at 61%. So obviously Tyrus, very, very solid. A lot of people out here still playing Moraine. Moraine's only at a 47% win rate. You have to feel like if these numbers start to switch, Dusk looks a little bit different. Okay, that being said, let's now just look at the last 2 weeks, okay? Here's the data set. I'm just over here at 813 and a 9-1. So really what this is doing is I'm just trying to mostly capture what happened this last weekend and what has happened since Old Umbri has come out. And so a lot of this is very small sample sizes, right? But you do still see Grimkin up here towards the top. You see Storm Legion a little bit higher, Bloodline Marauders a little bit higher. And here's your Old Umbri at 59, which is, pretty darn close to where they were here. Old Umbri was at 57. And so Umbri seems to be doing pretty well as they settle in. Infernals, for as much as they had a fantastic weekend at Nova Open, that win rate here of 58 is a tiny bit less than where they have been over the last 3 months. Crix may be looking a little bit more balanced. You have to wonder if a lot of people are now really sort of planning for Kythos. Kythos is at a 59% win rate, whereas that had been in the 60s. And maybe that's why you're seeing some of these other outliers come out, is because people figured out how to play into Kythos. To round out the rest of the lists, obviously, Gravediggers at 50, Sea Raiders at 48, and I think that's it for our big factions. That's right. Here's Khador at 39 and Callus at 38, clearly having some pretty terrible weekends. Although Khador did really bad, they did have some podiums, right? They had some top 8s, and they had some podium spots. So Khador did really well. Dusk really seems to have fallen off a little bit here. And part of that, I think, is I think the faction, obviously, on Dusk, I still think they're incredibly strong. I think they've just seen their representation draw off a little bit. Overall, though, I would say that the meta probably seems to be in a pretty good spot. I would commend Steamforge for we're months removed from the changes that have come out in January and a lot of new models being released so far this year, but the meta looks pretty helpfully. Obviously, the meta looks pretty healthy. Obviously, there's little things here and there that need to be nudged. The question is, should we have more than a once a year update so that something like Horus can get fixed or Zadaroth can get fixed? Or maybe some of these lower units can get brought up a little bit? Do we need sort of a July shakeup in the meta? Time will tell, but otherwise, really, I think the meta looks pretty great right now. Obviously, everybody's going to be kind of gearing up for Warmachine Weekend here soon, and we'll see how things go. Certainly excited to see how the year wraps up.